Every town has its secrets, stories whispered from generation to generation, sometimes lost in the passage of time, yet never entirely forgotten. In Ashwood, secrets are not confined to dusty photo albums or faded newspaper clippings. They breathe, they echo, and, if you listen closely, they speak. Here, the woods don't merely stand as silent witnesses to the passage of time, they whisper back. For decades, the people of Ashwood have lived on the edge of these ancient woods, bound by both tradition and fear. To an outsider, they might seem like nothing more than a beautiful but ordinary stretch of forest, a canopy of towering pines, gnarled oaks, and trails lined with wildflowers. But to those who call Ashwood home, these woods are anything but ordinary. Locals talk of voices carried on the wind, heard only when you're alone, footsteps that stop the moment you turn around, a chilling sense of being watched, even in the brightest daylight. And then there are the disappearances. Each year, someone vanishes, a hiker straying off the trail, a curious traveler ignoring the warnings, or, in some cases, a resident. Someone who should have known better. They step into the woods and are never seen again. Search parties comb the forest. Dogs lose the scent, and it's as though the earth itself swallows them whole. Ashwood's police chief once remarked, "We've searched every inch of those woods, but some things just don't want to be found." Perhaps it's the growing list of missing names, or the eerie silence that falls over Ashwood every time another one is added. But a kind of unspoken agreement has taken root among the people here. Don't ask too many questions. Don't go looking for answers. But some do. They always have. And their curiosity, their refusal to heed the warnings, has led to stories even more unsettling than the disappearances themselves. Sophie didn't plan on coming back to Ashwood. She hadn't set foot in the town since she left for college years ago, determined to leave behind the whispers, the stares, and the strange unease that always seemed to linger just beneath the surface. But when her mother's health began to deteriorate, Sophie had no choice. Family came first, even if it meant returning to a place she spent years trying to forget. Her childhood home was just as she remembered it: creaking floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and the ever-present sense of being watched by the woods beyond the backyard. But Sophie had changed. Now a logical, grounded young woman, she dismissed the superstitions she once feared as a child. Ghost stories were just that, stories. And yet, as she unpacked her belongings and settled in, she couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. The way neighbors seemed to avoid eye contact, the cryptic warnings from strangers in town. "It's good you're back, but stay out of the woods." She laughed them off, brushing aside the unease as nothing more than small-town paranoia. But then she found the journal. It happened one evening while Sophie was clearing out the attic. Dust hung heavy in the air, illuminated by the fading light from a single window. Among the boxes of forgotten photographs and old books, she found it. A leather-bound journal, cracked and weathered with age. The name on the inside cover stopped her cold. Edward Raines, her uncle, the one who disappeared 20 years ago, the one no one talked about anymore. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers brushing over the faint indentations of his handwriting. The first few pages were ordinary enough, simple accounts of his day-to-day life. But as she flipped through, the entries became increasingly disjointed, frantic, and unsettling. The trees, they whisper when the wind stops. Don't listen. Don't follow. Voices call from the dark, leading deeper, always deeper. The last entry was written in jagged, hurried strokes. "The woods are awake. If you find this, stay away." The words sent a chill down her spine. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the faint stirrings of fear. But fear wasn't enough to stop her. She had questions now, questions that demanded answers. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. The journal sat on her desk, its presence almost magnetic. She told herself it was just a book, but something about it felt alive, as though the words were pressing against her mind, demanding to be read again and again. Then she heard it. At first it was just a creak, a sound easily dismissed in an old house. But then came the faint rustling, like leaves brushing against a window, except the wind wasn't blowing. Sophie froze, straining her ears, and then, unmistakably, she heard it, footsteps outside her bedroom window. She rushed to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the moonlight. But as she turned to step away, she caught a flicker of movement, something disappearing into the woods. Sophie tried to shake it off, telling herself it was her imagination, but the noises persisted over the next few nights. Faint whispers that seemed to grow louder when she tried to ignore them. The sound of distant laughter that faded when she stepped outside. It was as though the woods were calling her, much like the journal described. She mentioned it to a neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in Ashwood her entire life. The woman's face grew pale, her hands trembling as she clutched Sophie's arm. "If you're hearing them, it means they've noticed you. Don't go into the woods, Sophie. Don't give them a reason to bring you in." But Sophie wasn't the kind to scare easily. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear, and when she found an old, hand-drawn map tucked into the back of her uncle's journal, marked with a trail leading deep into the forest, she knew she couldn't resist. Whatever happened to her uncle, whatever the whispers were, she had to know the truth. The warnings from the townspeople echoed in her mind, but they weren't enough to stop her. The journal, the map, the whispers, everything seemed to be pointing her toward the same place. Sophie told herself it was just an overactive imagination, that there was nothing truly dangerous about the woods. But as she stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the shadowy expanse, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots breaking the silence. Behind her, the town of Ashwood faded into the distance. Ahead, the woods seemed to shift and sway, as though welcoming her in. Sophie didn't rush her decision. Whatever lay within the woods, she knew she couldn't face it unprepared. The warnings in her uncle's journal, though cryptic, were clear. This wasn't just a forest. It was something far older, far stranger. She gathered what little she could find. A flashlight with fresh batteries, a compass she hadn't used since high school, and the journal itself, now filled with sticky notes and hastily scribbled annotations. She traced and retraced the map, committing every twist and turn to memory, though she couldn't shake the unease growing in her chest. In town, her preparations didn't go unnoticed. An older man at the hardware store shook his head as she bought a pocket knife and extra batteries. "Planning a camping trip?" he asked, his voice tinged with something like pity. When Sophie didn't answer, he leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a whisper. "People say the trees can move. The paths don't stay the same for long. Mark your way, or you might not make it back." She tried to laugh it off, but the look in his eyes stayed with her. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. The first steps into the forest were uneventful. For all the stories she'd heard, it seemed normal. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in golden patches. She followed the map closely, counting her steps, glancing at the compass every few minutes. But then, things began to change. At first, it was subtle. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the forest itself were closing in around her. The familiar sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. And then she saw them, the trees. The bark wasn't smooth or gnarled like she remembered. It seemed to shift, patterns forming that looked unnervingly like faces. Eyes, mouths, twisted expressions that seemed frozen in a silent scream. She told herself it was a trick of the light, but no matter how hard she blinked, the faces remained. Then came the footsteps. They started faint, distant, as though someone, or something, was following her. At first, she thought it was an echo of her own steps. But when she stopped, they didn't. They continued, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves just behind her. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping across the trees, but nothing was there. Only silence, broken by the softest sound. Her name, whispered so faintly she almost didn't hear it. "Sophie!" It sent a chill through her, but she pressed on, her grip tightening on the journal as though it were a talisman. After what felt like hours, Sophie stumbled into a clearing. The air was colder here, the ground littered with fallen leaves that seemed untouched by the wind. In the center stood an old stone altar, its surface covered in strange runes that matched the sketches in her uncle's journal. Her heart raced as she approached, the journal open in her hands, flipping between its pages and the runes on the altar. It felt like a connection, as though her uncle had been here, standing in this very spot. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, and then she saw it. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its shape barely distinguishable from the trees behind it. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to call out, but the words stuck, her voice drowned out by the pounding of her heart. Summoning what courage she could muster, she took a step forward, and the figure disappeared. Not into the trees, not away. It simply ceased to exist, leaving the clearing as empty as it had been before. But Sophie didn't feel alone. Shaken, Sophie turned back to her compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on a direction. Panic set in as she realized the map, so carefully memorized, no longer seemed to match her surroundings. The trees looked different, the trails she thought she'd marked with stones now gone. She tried retracing her steps, but every path seemed to lead her deeper into the forest. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and incoherent. The faces in the trees seemed to watch her, their expressions shifting as she passed. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced at the edges of her vision. The journal slipped from her grasp, its pages scattering across the ground, and as she bent to retrieve it, she heard it again. "Sophie, come closer." She turned, and the shadowy figure was there again, closer this time, its form clearer but still impossible to define. It didn't move toward her, but she felt its pull, a magnetic force drawing her closer, her feet moving despite herself. Desperate, she tore her gaze away and ran, the whispers now a cacophony around her. The compass was useless, the map forgotten. All she could do was run, her breath ragged, her heart pounding as the forest seemed to close in around her. And then, the ground beneath her gave way. When Sophie regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the cold, hard floor of what seemed to be a cabin. The walls were lined with cobwebs, the wood rotting and warped, as though the structure itself had been abandoned for decades. A faint, musty smell filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of rust. Or was it blood? Pushing herself up, her hands brushed against something hard and sharp. She looked down to find a pile of artifacts scattered across the floor, rusted watches, torn clothing, photographs with faces faded by time. Her stomach churned as she realized what they were, belongings of the missing townspeople, each item a silent testimony to someone who had never returned. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden beneath a tattered coat, was a journal. Not hers, but his. The name scrawled across the cover was unmistakable. Edward Raines, her uncle. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The entries, written in the same frantic handwriting as the journal she found at home, painted a chilling picture of his final days. He described the altar in detail, how it pulsed with energy that seemed to seep into his very bones. He spoke of the voices that grew louder with each passing day, how they promised him answers, but demanded his loyalty. And finally, he wrote of his plan to destroy it, a desperate attempt to sever whatever connection the altar had to the woods. The final page was barely legible, the ink smudged and jagged. "It won't let me leave. It knows my name. It's hungry, and I've fed it too much. If anyone finds this, run." As Sophie read the words, a wave of nausea hit her. The whispers returned, this time louder, almost taunting. And suddenly she understood. The woods weren't just alive, they were feeding. On fear, on pain, on those foolish enough to enter. And now, they had her. Sophie felt the air grow colder, the room darker, as though the cabin itself were collapsing in on her. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The entity defied explanation. Its form was ever-changing, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and faces, as if it had been pieced together from the very people it had consumed. Its voice wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a vibration that seemed to originate within Sophie's own mind. "Welcome, Sophie," it said, the words dripping with mockery and malice. She staggered back, clutching her uncle's journal like a lifeline. "You've come so far, just like Edward, always so curious, always so bold. But now you're here, and I have an offer for you." The entity's form shifted again, growing taller, its face morphing into something eerily familiar. Her uncle's face, though distorted and lifeless. Sophie's heart raced as it continued. "Join me, Sophie. Become one with the woods, and I will give you what you've always wanted. No more loss, no more pain. Your family will never suffer again." The temptation in its voice was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She wanted to believe it, to accept the promise and end the torment. But then she looked at the journal, at her uncle's desperate, final words. She couldn't let herself be consumed. The struggle. Sophie gripped the journal tightly, flipping through the pages as the entity loomed closer. Her uncle had failed to destroy the altar, but his notes contained clues, symbols he believed could weaken the entity's hold. She backed toward the door, her flashlight flickering wildly, illuminating fragments of the entity's shifting form. The whispers grew deafening, threatening to drown out her thoughts, but she forced herself to focus. Her uncle's final entry mentioned the altar as the entity's anchor, a conduit for its power. If she could reach it, perhaps she could break its hold. The entity lashed out, its shadowy tendrils whipping toward her, but Sophie ducked and bolted out of the cabin. The forest was alive now, the trees bending and twisting to block her path, the faces in the bark sneering and writhing. But Sophie ran, clutching the journal like a shield, her flashlight guiding her through the chaos. She burst into the clearing, the altar glowing faintly in the moonlight. The entity was close behind, its voice reverberating in her skull. "You can't escape, Sophie. You belong to me now." With trembling hands, she tore a page from the journal, one filled with the symbols her uncle had drawn, and pressed it against the altar. The runes began to glow, the light searing and blinding. The entity shrieked, its form flickering and distorting, but it didn't disappear. Sophie realized the truth. It wasn't enough. The entity needed something in return. A sacrifice. Her uncle's journal fell open at her feet, the pages fluttering to the final, unfinished entry. And in that moment she understood. Her uncle's soul was still here, trapped, tethered to the altar like so many others. She could feel his presence, faint but desperate, pleading for release. The entity spoke again, its voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You can leave, Sophie, but he stays. Or you can stay, and he goes free." The choice was impossible. But as the whispers rose around her, Sophie knew what she had to do. With tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "I'm sorry," and pressed her palm against the altar. As the light engulfed the clearing, Sophie felt the world shift around her. The whispers faded, the trees stilled, and the air grew quiet. She opened her eyes to find herself alone, the altar cold and lifeless. Her uncle's journal lay at her feet, its pages blank, the words erased as though they had never existed. She looked around, but there was no sign of him, no sign of the entity either. But as Sophie turned to leave, she felt it, a faint, cold breath against her neck. And then, the softest whisper, almost inaudible. "We'll be watching." Sophie stumbled out of the woods just as the first light of dawn pierced through the trees. Her clothes were torn, her hands bloodied from the branches that clawed at her as she ran. The forest, which had seemed endless only moments before, now released her without resistance, as if it had grown tired of the chase. She collapsed onto the gravel path at the edge of Ashwood, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers had stopped, the oppressive weight of the woods lifted, but the silence was not a relief. It was a void, one that left her feeling hollow and untethered. For the first time in hours, Sophie looked at her hands. They were shaking, her fingers still clutching the remains of her uncle's journal, now charred and crumbling as if burned from the inside. She dropped it instinctively, staring as the ashes scattered in the wind. The woods had taken everything, and yet somehow they had let her go. Or had they? Physically, Sophie was unharmed, but she felt the scars deeper than flesh. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind was fractured, replaying the events of the night like a broken reel of film. It wasn't until she reached her mother's house, stepping into the familiar comfort of home, that she noticed it, the shadow. At first, it seemed normal, stretching behind her as she entered the kitchen. But then it moved, just slightly out of sync with her. She froze, turning sharply, but there was nothing there. She shook her head, dismissing it as exhaustion or the lingering effects of fear. But as the days passed, the shadow stayed. Always there, just at the edge of her vision. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it never left. Worse still was the feeling, the sense of being watched. It wasn't the same suffocating presence she'd felt in the woods, but something quieter, more patient. It didn't whisper or demand, it simply waited. Sophie tried to warn the townspeople, but her words were met with the same quiet dismissal that had shrouded Ashwood for generations. "The woods don't take everyone," one woman said with a nervous laugh. "You just had a bad dream." Even those who believed her didn't want to hear the details. They avoided her gaze, their own fears too deeply buried to confront. The town returned to its routines, the whispers of its own warnings fading into the background like an old wives' tale. Sophie became an outsider in her own home. People crossed the street to avoid her, their polite smiles thinly veiling their discomfort. She stopped trying to explain, retreating into herself, watching the woods from her window as if waiting for them to make the next move. Months passed, and Sophie began to rebuild her life, or at least the semblance of one. The woods remained at the edge of her vision, a constant reminder of what she had endured, but she convinced herself that she was free. Then, one night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. It was faint at first, barely more than a breeze against the window. But as the moments stretched on, it grew clearer. The same voice, the same tone, calling her name. Sophie. Her breath caught, her body stiffening as the sound surrounded her. She turned toward the window, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. The whispers faded into silence, leaving only her racing pulse and the oppressive weight of dread. And then, just as she closed her eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible laugh echoed from the shadows in the corner of the room. "Sophie, we're still here." Now that you've heard Sophie's story, what would you have done? Would you have stepped into the woods, knowing the risks? Would you have sacrificed everything for answers, or walked away, leaving the mystery behind? Everyone has their own dark corners, their own questions that whisper just out of reach. So tell us, what would you have sacrificed to uncover the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below,